In this episode, we talk about the dismantling of the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, and how that impacts the religious agencies that used to partner with the government agency. That's coming up. Hello and welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. So you've no doubt heard about what appears to be the shuttering of USAID. Some see this actually as a great thing. They cite spending on questionable projects. And others think we shouldn't be spending federal money on functions that could be done by the private sector, such as churches. People are asking, why does USAID matter? And even, why should it matter? So in this episode, I'm actually speaking with someone who is familiar with USAID and how it will impact the many nonprofits that work with the federal agency in projects around the globe. Alex Morse is a Deputy Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at Church World Service. Church World Service was founded back in 1946. It's a cooperative ministry of about 37 denominations and communions, and it provides sustainable self-help, development, disaster relief, and refugee assistance around the world. Alex is going to talk about how USAID works with Church World Service and other NGOs, and actually what's at stake with the loss of USAID. I think that this is a great primer on foreign aid if you're someone that is not very familiar with how foreign aid works, or not very familiar with how the USAID works, and why it makes a difference to people around the world, and also makes a difference in U.S. foreign policy. So let's listen in to this important conversation with Alex Morse. Well, Alex, I'm thankful you've been able to join with me to talk a little bit about foreign aid and the role that Church World Service plays in all of this. I wanted to start off just to learn a little bit about you yourself, and then also to talk about Church World Service, because I know that there are some people that know about it, but not everyone does.
First of all, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to get to join you today and get to talk a little bit about what's happening. I think it's just important to get as much information out there right now as possible. Unfortunately, there's a lot of sound bites. Some of it's accurate, some of it's not. But all of this has significant implications for our global neighbors. And I think it's important that we kind of ground ourselves in the facts of what's happening right now. So just really grateful to have the opportunity to share. So my name's Alex Morse. I'm the Deputy Regional Representative for Latin America and the Caribbean with Church World Service. So I've been with the organization now for the last 3 years, but grew up in a Disciples of Christ congregation. My dad's a Disciples pastor. I think I've been participating in crop walks since I was maybe an infant. I know we have a picture of my sister at 2 years old in a crop walk, and she's older than me. So I think I've been kind of a Church World Service person my whole life, and global justice has been something that's incredibly important to me my entire life. So a bit of my background. After undergrad, I was a volunteer missionary in the Dominican Republic with support from Week of Compassion and Global Ministries. I lived there for a year working with children at risk for commercial sexual exploitation and people living with HIV/AIDS. And then returned to the States. In 2010, I returned to the Dominican Republic as a volunteer. However, 3 days before I arrived, the Haiti earthquake happened. I was volunteering with Church World Service and got an email that said, your volunteer agreement has been changed slightly. We'll figure it out once you get here. And I ended up living and working on the Dominican border and traveling most days into Haiti for about 8 months of the initial earthquake response. After that, I went to grad school and studied international development, and then worked for a decade with an organization called Growing Hope Globally, which is a partner of several different Christian denominations. They work with farmers in the U.S. to raise resources for food security programs overseas. And so through that job, I had the opportunity to meet with several congregations across the U.S. and also get to know several food security programs across Latin America. And like I said, I started about 3 years ago in my current role with Church World Service, working on a lot of the same issues.
And how would you describe Church World Service? Lots of people, I'm aware of it. I've known about it for quite some time, but not everyone is aware of the agency. How would you describe them?
So Church World Service, some people might not know the name Church World Service, but know Crop Walk. They're the same thing. But Church World Service has been around for the last 75 years. They were initially founded by the World Council of Churches under the understanding of we can do together what none of us can do alone, recognizing the need for multiple Christian denominations to work together in order to respond to the overwhelming needs immediately following World War II. Currently, Church World Service represents about 9 million Christians across the United States from 14 different Christian denominations and faith-based organizations. We work on refugee resettlement. We work on providing emergency support to unaccompanied minors that arrive at the southern border. We do humanitarian relief work in the case of disasters. We're responding to the crisis currently in Ukraine, and we're prepared. And we also do sustainable development work around the world. One of the programs that I've worked on for the last couple of years is a USAID funded project in Honduras, in a particularly disaster-prone part of the country, working with rural households to help them be more prepared for disasters as climate change increases the risks that they face, and helping them adapt their farming systems so that they're able to be more productive and more resilient even as weather systems change.
And so with a lot of there are obviously, and we're only a month in, been a lot of changes in Washington when it comes to foreign aid. And that doesn't simply, kind of in our parlance, we think that it's usually that we're just giving money to different nations, but that's not really how it works. And it does actually involve some of the private sector. So how is Church World Service involved in foreign assistance, and how have the executive orders affected Church World Service?
Yeah. So Church World Service receives funding, like I mentioned, for the Sustainable Development Project that we're implementing in Honduras. That's been affected. We work with international partners with funding from the State Department to work with refugees in Egypt and in Indonesia. And then also CWS manages the Refugee Resettlement Program, which is part of the USRAP, United States Refugee Assistance Program. I'll try and avoid acronyms as much as possible. And we're responsible for much of the refugee resettlement out of sub-Saharan Africa. That means the U.S. government contracts us to provide services that they're not able to provide directly themselves. So, for example, with refugee assistance, we support refugees through the screening process. It's a process that's very long, very rigorous. It can be 7-10 years of screening. And as those potential cases are identified, CWS accompanies the case management throughout the process in preparation until they arrive in the U.S. And then we help connect them with affiliate organizations here as they get settled in.
And with all of the changes, how has that kind of affected things?
So Church World Service programs have been suspended. We've been served stop work orders and suspensions as part of the executive order on reevaluating and realigning U.S. foreign aid. That executive order came out on January 20th and then was followed up with instructions and memos January 22nd and 24th that not only froze those programs and instructed them to do no further work during a review period, but also froze all pending payments for existing work already completed. So with U.S. contracts and awards, some programs are funded with advanced funding and others are funded on a reimbursement basis. And it's this reimbursement basis that's causing such a catastrophic impact right now in the nonprofit sector. Organizations haven't received payments for work already completed, and so we have bills outstanding with employees, we have past wages due. We have contracts and obligations to vendors, all of these things, and there's no cash being sent from the U.S. government in order to reimburse those existing obligations. There is a report from the Inspector General and in the statement that came out from acting USAID Administrator Pete Morocco that showed that USAID, since Trump took power, has only dispersed 0.02% of the funds that they owe or obligated.
Wow. And so basically you have a lot of organizations right now that say they have budgeted for this and budgeted that there was going to be money coming in from reimbursement from the federal government that would then pay for things like salaries that right now they're not even being you're not even getting that.
Correct. So, a lot of organizations, try and have a reserve. Normally, I think the best practice among nonprofits is to have a 3-month reserve. But when you aren't reimbursed for 3 months worth of work, suddenly your reserve is totally gone without any notice. And that's the issue that the courts are having with this action that the Trump administration has taken, is the courts found that the actions are arbitrary and capricious is the legal language that they're using, which is that there's no justification. And even after they've submitted multiple legal briefs in the case, they've provided no justification for why it's necessary to freeze these payments under contracts that they've already awarded in order to conduct a review of foreign aid, which is ostensibly what they're saying they're trying to do. And it's having incredibly detrimental impacts. So to jump back to the timeline a little bit, the foreign aid freeze really came into effect around January 24th. On February 10th and 11th, 2 court cases were brought forward challenging the executive order. Those are the Global Health Council versus Donald J. Trump and AIDS Vaccine Coalition versus U.S. Department of State. I'm sorry, I'm reading this because I want to make sure that I get it correct. So 2 groups of plaintiffs brought cases. Within the next 48 hours, in retribution, they were served 41 program termination notices. And at that point, they appealed for a temporary restraining order against the administration to prevent further harm.
One moment here. So basically, you're saying that these organizations brought forward a suit and the government basically retaliated against them for doing this.
Yes. And in the court record and in evidence submitted, you can see internal memos of USAID directors telling staff to speed up termination notices, setting new deadlines that hadn't previously existed, trying to get ahead of the court order. So it's either they're actions that appear to either be in bad faith or in retaliation. And I'm trying to be really careful in the way that I present this because I think it's good to use the same standard that the courts are using, which is we can't just do speculative comments on all this. I think the evidence there is concerning enough without editorializing or speculating. And so I try to be really careful with how I present these things. But because of the appearance of retribution, the court ordered a temporary restraining order, ordering USAID to immediately freeze and rescind, or the language that the court used was to set aside the actions taken as a result of the executive order. And so that meant that USAID was to send notices, USAID and Department of State were to send notices to all organizations impacted by the suspension notices and to immediately begin disbursement of funds that are already obligated. They asked for a status report. That came out on February 18th, so you can see we're now into Tuesday of this week. And the administrator of USAID said, in our understanding, we're allowed to do all of this. And so now we're waiting to see the courts ordered them again to lift the freeze, lift the suspensions, reinstate payments. But in the meantime, there's irreparable harm being caused. It's incredible to see the disregard for human life that's taking place right now as a result of these decisions to not implement a court order. One of the plaintiffs brought a declaration, submitted it to the court. So it's under penalty of perjury, they've declared that their estimates are that since the court order was issued on February 13th, just in one program that this person manages, 400 mothers have died suffering from severe bleeding following childbirth and postpartum hemorrhages. 240 women died during childbirth due to other factors. and 320 infants died for lack of life-saving resuscitation. Sorry if I get a little emotional with that.
No, that's okay.
If we expand those numbers to the 29 days of the foreign aid freeze, just in one program, 3,480 lives that have estimated to be lost. That's one program out of 7,000 programs that are currently suspended. Not all of them provide life-saving work like that one does, but they meet basic needs. They protect children and youth. They invest in the future. They create goodwill for Americans across the world. This is, as somebody that's dedicated their life to this work, it's incredibly painful to watch. And then also as a person of faith, it's just heartbreaking. I don't know how we can do anything but have our hearts be broken right now, seeing this damage. And then to see that level of damage being done in order to prevent waste is just even more frustrating, because the stop work order is generating a level of waste far beyond anything that's been found in any program to date. The Inspector General report shows that there's $8.2 billion worth of food assistance currently in ports and on ships. $8.2 billion in frozen aid assistance. That includes $489 million in food aid, which I worked with farmers, so I'm going to put it in bushels. It's 21 million bushels of food sitting and rotting on ships and ports right now because they're not allowed to unload that, or not allowed to continue transportation of those goods. One single plaintiff in the case reported that they have $478 million worth of medications that are currently sitting in storage or waiting to be delivered. That represents medication that's life-saving and could prevent 800,000 deaths. You know, the fact that we have these resources that are incredibly needed sitting there, rotting or going to waste, to me is just unconscionable.
What do you say, and this kind of gets into the whole talk about foreign aid itself. And I know, because I've heard the statistics for years, that foreign aid it's not a major part of our budget, the U.S. federal budget, maybe about 1%, if even that. So, we're not going to save any kind of deficit or debt by getting rid of it. What do you say, though, to people who would say that this is something basically that the church should do? The government doesn't need to spend money on this.
I would say that that's a weak argument. I don't think that there's any reason that we can't do both. I think absolutely the church should be doing this. The church has a moral obligation to respond to that that comes straight from the scriptures. And at the same time, the U.S. government has an interest in doing these programs as well. Maybe not just for purely altruistic or ethical considerations, but for our own selfish reasons as well. These programs by goodwill across the world. I've traveled to some of the most remote places in the Latin America region through my career. I've been to the far northwest corner of Haiti, where there's not a single paved road in the entire department, and traveled to the furthermost tip of that department, where you can look across the ocean and almost see Cuba, which is just 90 miles away. And there's food aid there with the USAID logo on it that says, "From the American people." These programs require every single thing that's distributed under them to have branding and marking that says "From the American people," right? I've been through some very remote and unsafe places in Colombia where there's active drug trafficking and where coca is produced. It's the precursor for cocaine. And as an American, I was totally safe because people were familiar with the U.S. government. They viewed some of the actions of the U.S. government as negative, but they were able to separate that from the American people, right? They were able to be opposed to some of the actions of the U.S. government and hold very favorable opinions of American people. And it's because, even after riding in a canoe 2 hours down the river, again, there were materials there with the USAID logo on it and the words "From the American people." So I think we underestimate the impact that has in the Latin America region. It allows Americans to be held in high esteem. There were reports that came out under the Bush administration and under the first Trump administration. It also shows, too, that countries are more willing to participate in military and strategic alliances with the United States because of the foreign aid assistance that they receive. So this is a way that we build alliances. It's a way that we build soft power. It has incredible value. It's very distinct. It's very distinct from the motivations that we have for churches giving, right? But it fulfills a lot of the same needs. And churches, frankly, aren't able to provide the same level of resources as the US government.
Mm-hmm.
Foreign assistance is equal to about under USAID, it's equal to about 0.1% of the entire federal budget. That's equal, I'm conflating numbers here. So yes, it's about 1% of the total budget for the Department of State, maybe a little above that, but not much. But that's equal to 42% of all humanitarian aid provided at the global level. Churches are not able to step up and provide anywhere near that level of resources. And so I think it's important that churches give, but I think it's also important that churches raise our voice and be strong advocates and call out for justice and demand at least responsible administration of resources and programs. And do what we can to protect the sanctity of human life. One of the things that's come out in the court case is again and again, and I mentioned it already, that there was no reason for these programs to be suspended without notification in order for a review to be conducted. All programs are already reviewed before they're ever funded, right? So the idea that there's not been thorough reviews is absurd. But on top of that, there's nothing that prevents somebody from reviewing a program while it's ongoing, right? They have all of our documentation. There's no reason that we can't be in the field working on the project at the same time that they're conducting those reviews. And part of the foreign aid freeze even stipulated that during the first 30 days, they were going to determine what the standards for review would be. So to pause foreign aid for 30 days, cost thousands of lives around the world, cause hundreds of thousands of staff to be unemployed, just so you have time to write a policy of how you're going to review programs makes no sense. It's immoral, it's unjust, and it's illogical. I'm obviously a big proponent of foreign assistance, but if they were to terminate USAID or to terminate the program, there's no reason why they couldn't do it in the same way that they're looking at terminating the Department of Education, where they've stated that their goal is to terminate the Department of Education December 31st, 2025, right? Why not give notice that this review is coming? Why not give notice that a suspension is coming? Why not allow partners around the world doing life-saving work time to file for waivers prior to implementing the freeze and suspension? There is no, in my opinion, there's no explanation for it other than cruelty. And I think foreign assistance is a very vulnerable target. I think it's easy to lie and to vilify and to distort how foreign assistance is used. We've seen that already through the way that Trump and Musk are talking about some of these programs. Some of it's unintentional. I don't think they meant to misstate that the program benefiting Gaza, they interpreted it as Gaza Palestine when it was Gaza Tanzania. I don't think that was intentional, but I think it shows that they're being careless as they review these programs. But I think it also gave them a talking point that they were very excited to use. And then also they keep referring to this as corruption and waste. There's not corruption and waste in these programs. They're thoroughly audited. They're heavily regulated. They undergo the same oversight and regulations and review processes as all other government contracts. And one of the largest for-profit companies that does development work actually submitted in their declaration to the courts the other day that in the past 4 or 5 years of audits where they've implemented over $8 billion worth of funding, their audits had found 0.08% of that had gone to waste. I think most of us would hope to get like a 99.92% on a test. That would be thrilling to get that high of a score. So these funds are very well administered, but it's easy to find examples of programs that don't align with their policy agendas or make easy targets. And so they bring forward those examples and claim for them to be fraud or waste, when really they're just programs they didn't like. They're legally funded programs being executed very well that don't align with their policy agendas, but it gives them talking points that they can then use to get support for a power grab.
What do you think is the impact of all of this when, if they go through and dismantle USAID and the pauses on foreign aid is more permanent? What do you think are the consequences, both on the ground, but also, I think, for the United States?
I think in the short term, it's more loss of human life. I think that's without a doubt. There was a conference of European donors yesterday that said, there is no way that we can fill this gap The U.S. government provided 42% of foreign assistance at the global level. Governments cannot fill that gap overnight, right? So again, had this been implemented in a different way, there's maybe ways that could have allowed for other actors to step in and fill some of those gaps to a greater extent, or transition to a mode of operation where there's less foreign assistance as the standard, right? But the abruptness of it is going to cost, in this short term, significant loss of human life. I think with that, there's a lot of anger and resentment for Americans. I think it significantly tarnishes our reputation. I think it significantly harms, especially the reputation of the U.S. government. I was talking to one of my colleagues in Haiti the other day, and we keep comparing and contrasting Americans coming to terms with what's happening in our country right now with the experience of Haitians who have seen the total collapse of their government over the last 3 years. And he said, over the last 3 years, we've seen that nobody wants to do business with the Haitian government because you can see that their contracts may or may not be honored and they may or may not be paid. Now I see the United States government contracts are worth the same as the Haitian government contracts. I never imagined that I would live to see that day. It used to be that the word of the American government was as good as gold. It's backed up with reserves. There just simply isn't a history of the United States acting in this way. And I think that has serious repercussions that we really can't even begin to fathom right now. Yeah.
And what are the implications, especially for organizations like Church World Service? I know that this has to have had some impact on jobs, both here in the United States, but also abroad.
Yeah, so we've had to reduce staffing levels, obviously. Plaintiffs in the case, go into the thousands of jobs that they've had to eliminate. One organization has had to shrink their staff from 285 staff to 10 people due to the foreign assistance cuts. So livelihoods, are at stake. But again, I have a lot of compassion for people that are working in this field that are maybe facing unemployment or a furlough or a long period of uncertainty. I'm especially mindful of the 24 staff working on the project that I oversee in Honduras. I was talking to one of those staff people and they said, it's not just 24 jobs, it's 24 families that depend on those jobs. And right now there's no other job opportunities available because this funding freeze is affecting every organization in the country right now. So I have a ton of compassion for the employees that are being affected. My heart's broken even more for the families that have lost access to benefits that they had been promised under these awards and these agreements. The testimonies are heartbreaking when you read through them, of the individual stories and the individual impact that this is having on families. Church World Service case that's Pasito v. Trump, that's being heard next week around the U.S. refugee. You have Congolese individuals who have been vetted for years through the refugee admission. Sorry, I keep calling it assistance and its admission program. You have people that were vetted for years. They're trying to move to the United States to be reunited with their families. They have their plane ticket bought. They have their suitcase packed and are suddenly told, you're not getting on tonight's flight because this order has come through. So families not being able to be reunited, people being left in situations where there's obvious fear of harm and physical danger to them, people not being able to access medication, etc. As I was preparing for the interview, I was looking at scriptures, right? And to me, the most relevant is Matthew 25. And we always read in church the positive side of it, oh, when did we see you do this? And we did this great thing for you, right? But the second part of Matthew 25, 41 is, and then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, for I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison and you did not look after me. They'll answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you? And the answer is, we're doing it right now.
So what can people do to help? How can they raise their voices?
When we were getting ready for this conversation, I saw that your church gives to Global Refuge. It's a great organization. I don't have any connections with them, but they do similar work to Church World Service. So if you're part of a congregation that gives to a program that does refugee resettlement, that does global development, that does humanitarian relief, I encourage you to continue giving, because the needs that they're facing are probably significant right now. I know in the Disciples denomination right now, a lot of congregations are taking offerings for Week of Compassion. They're working to respond to a lot of these funding gaps that are facing organizations around the world. I'd encourage you to go to the websites of the organizations that you already support. Look and see what their calls to action are, see what their requests are beyond just monetary relief. If you're able to give, great. But there's also a need to call Congress people. I think it's especially important if you live in a red district or a red state to call your elected representatives and make your voice heard. I think especially with this administration, it's critical that we have Christians calling and identifying as Christians and reminding their Congress people that as Christians, we care deeply about our global neighbors. And that as people of faith, this is an issue that's important to us. And I think it's important to pray. I think sometimes we don't give sufficient credence to the power of that. I think it's Gustavo Gutierrez that says prayer, action. And after the prayer is a deep breath while you wait for God to move you. And hopefully that moves you towards action and inspires the action that you take of advocacy or whatever you're doing in order to strive towards.
What do you think are the next steps for Church World Service and other organizations, especially with this suit? Where do you see them moving forward?
Right now, my evenings are me opening up 4 different pending court cases on my phone and hitting refresh, hoping for some kind of good news. There's currently 4 or 5 cases in front of different courts where either temporary restraining orders have been issued or preliminary injunctions are being heard. To some extent, we're in wait and see to see what happens as far as court orders, to see what happens with whether or not this administration respects the decisions of the courts. We're in a really unprecedented time. The partner that we work with in Honduras keeps saying, well, how do these cases normally work out? And to be honest, we don't have any idea how these court cases are going to work out because there's not a parallel or a precedent that we can really look to that can inform us on what to expect. So we're hoping for positive outcomes in a number of different pending cases. We're hoping that the court order that mandates the resumption of payments, especially pending payments for reimbursement, get prioritized and get processed quickly. Our understanding, and this is through declarations in the court record, is that the State Department has intentionally broken their payment system so that they cannot honor the court order.
Well, the second I have to do this, but literally they broke their system so that they can't.
So they've implemented a new process. Previously, the way the process worked was as an award recipient, we're required, after going through a thorough review process, we receive an award agreement. Our award agreement, for example, in Honduras, that we have with a local organization called the Comisión de Acción Social Menonita, which is the Mennonite Social Action Commission. It's a Honduran organization. They're the leader of the award. And the award agreement that they signed with USAID is 192 pages long of terms, conditions, etc. And that refers back to the federal regulations that apply to all awards and agreements, right? So there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of terms and conditions that we have to follow. Part of that stipulates what reports are due when, what those reports have to include, what costs are allowable, allocable, and reasonable, etc., right? And as long as we comply with those terms and conditions and are not in violation of them, when we submit a request for payment, those funds get dispersed. So the way that it works is if there's any violations or any concerns, payments get blocked by the award agreement, by the award officer. The new process that they've put in place requires that any payment request goes to the award officer first, who then has to confirm again that everything is good in the system, that's already good in the system. They then are now required to send that to a regional team. There's 5 regional teams reviewing these payment requests. And then all of those payment requests come from those regional teams, if approved, get sent to one single individual appointed by the White House for final review. Based on the number of award agreements and the terms of payments, This single individual is now responsible for reviewing and approving somewhere around 120,000 and 150,000 payment requests per year. It's not a viable system, and it's not even the person's sole responsibility. And again, these are coming from internal memos, internal messages created within the State Department and created within USAID. And so they've intentionally created a mechanism where it's impossible for them to comply with the court order. And so they're trying to argue that the process they put in place is, again, there to prevent fraud and corruption, but it's obviously a stalling tactic. It's not a viable process that could be completed in good faith.
How are you fighting any type of misinformation or misconceptions about foreign aid? And granted, there has been a lot. I've seen that on X/Twitter and probably other places, but how do you deal with that?
I'd encourage people to go straight to the source. That's where I found a lot of encouragement. Anyone can post anything that they want to on Twitter. It doesn't make it factual, right? And I don't want to get into fact checking several different disingenuous tweets that have come out from various people over the last month disparaging foreign aid and assistance. I would encourage people to go to two very reliable sources. One is the Office of the Inspector General of USAID. This is the independent watchdog responsible for auditing the activities of USAID. You can find the reports on waste and corruption. You can find the reports on what's happening right now and the impact of the foreign aid freeze. It's public information that's been prepared by an independent agency of the government. And additionally, I'd really encourage people to go to the court records. It's dry, it's legalese, but these are sworn affidavits where misstatements or inaccuracies are punishable by perjury, right? It's one thing to say on Twitter, I think XYZ. It's another thing to say in a sworn declaration, I believe to the best of my ability in front of the court under penalty of perjury, X, Y, and Z. So I really encourage people to go to those two sources for the most up-to-date, most reliable information on what's happening with these cases. And if you hear a claim online that sounds outrageous or angers you, I would take that to be a sign that maybe you need to do some due diligence on that and to see if there's actual grounding basis for those claims and accusations in another source, or in another reliable source. Yeah.
If people want to know, and you've already shared some links, are there links available through CWS that would kind of help them to at least keep abreast of what's going on?
Yeah. On cwsglobal.org, there are links to take action that again provide very clear language on things that you can ask your congressperson or elected representative to do. There's also regular press releases that we issue updating people on the pending litigation that affects Church World Service. And we also provide a lot of factual information on the types of services that are being provided both to unaccompanied minors through legal assistance and through post-relief services. And then updates on what refugee resettlement is and what the impact of canceling refugee admissions programs is. So I would also recommend cwsglobal.org as a very reliable source on some of the humanitarian impacts that these executive orders are having.
Alex, thank you so much for this. This has been helpful. I know this has also been very emotional for you, but I think this is important to get this out to people to understand the whole scope of the situation. And I hope to actually have you back for kind of an update because I don't think this is anything that's going to be ending anytime soon.
Just thank you so much for having me. I hope there is a soon update that's positive. We keep watching each decision and hoping that there's some good news buried in the 15 pages of legalese, etc. I just ask that you guys all keep us in your prayers, especially during this 90-day period of uncertainty. Who knows what comes after this? Try to be optimistic, but I keep finding that my optimism makes it hard for me to imagine how cruel some of these decisions can be. Hopefully we're facing the worst of it right now. We'll keep hoping that. Yeah, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to have a platform to share some of what's happening. And if nothing else, the opportunity to share some of what I've spent dozens and dozens of hours learning over the last few weeks, reading legal briefs and court findings and all of that. So just thank you for your time too.
You're welcome. All right. Thanks, Alex. Take care. things are changing on this issue. And actually, when we concluded our interview on last Friday, on February 21st, Alex kind of wanted me to make sure I just kind of be aware that things might be changing, and just to kind of make sure that that's included in this podcast. I'm recording this on Thursday evening, February 27th, and last night on February 26th, there were two updates to this whole story, and I want to share this. There, the first one actually is well, they're both important, but the first one is that Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts allowed for a continued freeze on foreign aid payments. This freeze actually was scheduled to expire at midnight on Wednesday. What I want to do is read you a part of an article from the New York Times. So this is from the New York Times. Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. on Wednesday night handed the Trump administration a victory for now in saying that the U.S. Agency for International Development and the State Department did not need to immediately pay for more than $1.5 billion in already completed aid work. A federal judge had set a midnight deadline for the agencies to release funds for the foreign aid work, which was withheld in the wake of the president's Day One directive to gut U.S. spending overseas. The Trump administration, in an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court just hours before the deadline, said the judge had overstepped his authority and interfered with the president's obligations to make appropriate judgments about foreign aid. Chief Justice Roberts issued an administrative stay, an interim measure meant to preserve the status quo while the justices consider the matter in a more deliberate fashion. The Chief Justice ordered the challengers to file a response to the application on Friday, which is tomorrow, and the court is likely to act not long after. So that was about the what was happening at the Supreme Court. Another event actually happened on Wednesday. This is actually in some ways directly related to what we talked about, what I talked about with Alex. So again, from that article in the New York Times. In another aggressive move on Wednesday to carry out the president's directive, lawyers for the Trump administration said that it was ending nearly 10,000 U.S. Agency for International Development and State Department contracts and grants. The pair of administration actions stunned diplomats and aid workers already reeling from mass firings at USAID, which funds food, health, development, and democracy programs abroad, and which the Trump administration has systematically dismantled. A former senior USAID official said the cuts account for about 90% of the agency's work and tens of billions of dollars in spending. The cuts deal a catastrophic blow to USAID's implementing partners and the populations they serve, likely bankrupting many and shuttering life-saving and important programs forever, a group of agency workers and partners said in a fact sheet distributed Wednesday night. Several aid workers and USAID officials said that at least some of the money for the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, or PEPFAR, has been eliminated, including elements of the program that were previously deemed essential life-saving work and exempted from the aid freeze. So that is from the New York Times. For those who don't know, PEPFAR was a program that was started under President George W. Bush that dealt with trying to provide especially AIDS drugs to people in places around the world, especially in Africa. Around the time when that was happening, HIV and AIDS was pretty much going out of control in Africa. And President Bush was able to create this program, which I think did make a difference around the world. And it seems like, according at least to the New York Times article, that program, at least some of the money, has been eliminated. There's a lot that I could say here, but I think that Alex did most of the work that needed to be said. I don't need to say anymore. But that is the update. And I'm going to be checking in with Alex. I really do want to talk to other people that are associated with USAID. I actually do have some hopes to interview some people who did work under in USAID to talk a little bit more about this program. It's an agency that I'm aware of, but not everyone is aware of. And I think there has been a lot of misinformation about it. And I will be honest, like there's always going to be programs that make do questionable things, and there is always need for reform. Whether this is the right way I don't think that this is the right way to do it. It will have impacts around the world. It's not a good thing to do. But like I said, I need to let Alex say that. There will be time when I will say more. But for now, I'm not. But I want to know what your views are on foreign aid or on USAID specifically. I'm curious if you know of anyone who worked with USAID or with an NGO that is now affected by these cuts. And I'd really like to hear what you all are thinking. I know I say that all the time, but I really would like to know because this is an issue that people don't know about much. Foreign aid is one of those things where people think they know it, but they don't know everything. And I'm not saying that people are stupid, but it's just an issue. We don't always know everything. So if you have views or opinions on these cuts, if you are someone that worked with USAID, especially if you were just laid off, or you worked for an NGO that's being affected and you were laid off, I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to hear what you did. What was a USAID like? So please send me an email at churchandmain@substack.com. Again, you can send me an email at churchandmain@substack.com. And I will include links to this New York Times article that came out, I believe it was either late last night or early this morning. I also put links to Church World Service if you want to donate to help in whatever way you can in the show notes. If you want to learn more about this podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, check out churchandmain.org. And also if you want, please check out churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. And I do hope that you will consider thinking about donating. I really want to, especially in these times, do more articles, more talks about all this. And putting a podcast does cost. So, if you are able to kick in a few bucks to help, there are ways that you can do that. There are links in the show notes where you can do a one-time payment or you can subscribe. So if you can do that, that would be very helpful. Also, I hope that you would consider subscribing. You can do that on your favorite podcast app. And then also that you would consider leaving a rating or a review. That does help other people find the podcast. So that is it for this episode of Church in Maine. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.